about Bloomsbury by way of introduction. My name is Woodman, I'm one of the ministers here, and it's a particular delight for me to be able to welcome you all to this event in this place, because on the 29th of October 1961, Martin Luther King himself preached in this church. I don't think we have anybody here tonight who was at that service, but there are people who are still part of the life of this church who were there and who remember it and who have spoken about it. He preached at the morning service a sermon called The Three Dimensions of the Complete Life. And I just wanted to read you a very short quote of what he said when he was here. He said, "Is your faith in organised religion? Not totally. Yes, my faith is in the church, within the church, the spiritual church, but sometimes I get worried about our particular churches. We are busy warring amongst ourselves, caught up in narrow sectarianism, giving out sanctions to the status quo. Slavery couldn't have survived in America if the church hadn't sanctioned it. Segregation would be dead as a doornail in the South today if the Southern white church took a stand against it." Salutary words, I think, that we need to continue to hold as we think about issues around inclusion and justice and the relationship between those and the place of the Christian church. 5 years ago yesterday, this church hosted a service marking the 65th anniversary of the Windrush. And I know some people who are here tonight were here 5 years ago for that service. But if you rewind even further, back to 1851, just a few years after this church was founded, the Great Exhibition was happening in London, and there were quite a lot of white Southern Baptists coming over to London for the Great Exhibition, and many of them were applying for communion tickets to come and take communion at this church. And the minister at the time, in 1851, was very concerned about the cause of slavery. And the church took a very momentous decision, which it published in the Times so that it would be known. And that decision was this: that this church cannot admit to the fellowship of the Lord's table any person whatsoever who either sympathises with or supports the fugitive slave law of the United States, or who holds his influence, or who withholds his influence from the efforts which are being made for restoring to the coloured population of the United States the rights of which they have been so wickedly deprived." Very much terms of 1851, you will understand, but nonetheless a significant statement that there is a way in which the church can take its stand against exclusion, and it's my privilege to serve a church that continues to take that stand on issues of ethnic inclusion and inclusion in other ways. Anyway, enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Deborah, who's going to talk a little bit more about what's happening, and then we'll go on watching the film.
Thank you, Simon. On behalf of Baptist Justice Hub and our organisation, Tipping Point North South, I just want to echo Simon's welcome and to say that so I'm Deborah Burton, I'm one of the co-founders of this. It's a fairly small organisation. We work across film, campaigning and events, social justice campaigning. And when we came here for a test to see how all of this would work out, it did give a little bit of a chill to be sitting where you are and to see the film projected onto the space where King stood and preached. So that's what's happening tonight. I feel in a little way we're bringing him back to life here. We are our organisation, embarking on taking this film out to communities. We have a public performance licence. We have a new project called MRK Global, which is about trying to tell the story of the internationalism of King and the international relevance of King, particularly latterly at the end of his life. There's a bit on the programme there if you'd like to know about what we're doing. We would love you to engage with us. I think we can bring the film to your communities. Just keep in touch if there's stuff here that interests you. The film was made in 1970 to mark the 2nd anniversary of the assassination, and it was released for one night only across the US, and then it sat in an archive or a vault somewhere, and it's been re-released for this 50th anniversary. We mark 50 years since the assassination of Dr. King. As Simon said, the film is 3 hours long. You will not miss it going. It is an immersion in Dr. King. Interval after an hour and a half. Break after the second part. And then, keep the energy there. We have a fantastic panel afterwards to discuss a bit more about King's legacy now. I think that's all I want to say. Other than, in the 2 breaks, we're going to have a little question box. So to save time, questions from the floor, we're just taking written questions. So pop your question in if stuff occurs to you as you're watching, and the panel will pick them up after they've had a bit of discussion. So thank you for coming, and I'm being with us tonight. Thanks.
What I would say is that Bishop Wilfred Wood, the first Anglican bishop, actually founded something called the Martin Luther King 12 many, many years ago. And I was one of the original members of that. And Bishop Wood, of course, was very, very keen that the legacy of Martin Luther King was something that was maintained. And the Martin Luther King 12 still runs. Every year there is an annual lecture, so keep a lookout on the internet for when the next date is. What we're going to do this evening is basically 3 things. I'm going to do a quick intro of this distinguished panel, ask a few of them to say a few things, and of course we'll have an opportunity for some questions, comments, and observations from the floor. I'd like to start by saying that we have a number of really, really distinguished people here, in no particular order. If I just start with Richard. Richard Reddie wrote an interesting and very enlightening biography of Martin Luther King. He is the Deputy Head of Religion for Christian Aid. We've got Eleasah there, who is a tutor at Christ Church, Canterbury University. She's also a PhD student, very much concerned with issues of black religion and black identity. We have Neil Jameson. Neil and I have been friends and colleagues for many, many years. Neil is the Chief Executive and the founder of Citizens UK. And of course, Citizens UK have done some amazing work nationally, but it all started in the East End of London under the title of Telco, the East London Citizens Organisation. Then we have Selina Stone, who is a tutor at St. Mellitus College in political theology. Selina is also doing some work around black theology and the Pentecostal churches in respect of activism. And then we have, of course, Dionne Gravesande from Christian Aid, but also she's going to say something about ML King Global. So these are our folks. Can we just give them a round of applause, please? You will probably notice on your program that we would have had Professor Robert Beckford here this evening, but Robert, unfortunately, is unable to join us as he's got some domestic issues. So I'm going to start, firstly, by asking Richard to say something about either response to the film, which was powerful, or something about Martin Luther King that you find really, really important and powerful.
Good evening. In terms of a film, I was fortunate that I had an opportunity to see it a couple of months ago. First time around, I thought it was very powerful, still think it is very powerful. As somebody who kind of has written a biography of Dr. King, I wouldn't say I assumed I knew everything about him, that's never the case, but the documentary was very revealing. There are certain things that I hadn't seen or even noted. And some of this is, it doesn't have to be too sort of profound. So for instance, we all know that Dr. King's right-hand man was Ralph Abernathy, and I've said this before. I never heard him speak before. And you hear him speak in this documentary. You know, Ralph Abernathy probably spent more time with Martin Luther King than anyone else, even more time than his wife, Coretta. But, you know, he is someone who you just see beside Dr. King, and to hear him speak is quite revelatory. I think the other thing is, and you see this from the outset, you see Dr. King in 1955, and you realize how young he was when he first started. He was, 26? And then over the course of 13 years, which was the span of his public life, you see him age. And by the end, you see a man who looks as if he's literally carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. And you can see how he has aged over that particular span. I think that the final thing I'll say is I really like the intro. And I suppose the whole nature of a documentary doesn't provide context, but the intro gives you a fascinating insight in terms of what was taking place in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, particularly 1966, where you see the juxtaposition of race-related issues as well as Vietnam. So you see the situation where you have a couple of individuals like Floyd McKissick of CORE, and you see Stokely Carmichael talking about black power. And it's at that particular juncture where issues such as race really come to the fore within the civil rights movement. And here you have Dr. King, who is very much about integrated walks and marches under pressure from individuals such as Stokely Carmichael and Floyd McKissick, who question integration, who question the involvement of white folks in civil rights activities. And also, these individuals are ones who question the philosophy as well as the tactic of nonviolence. And it's fascinating that Dr. King always bought into nonviolence, and organizations like SNCC, SNCC, or CORC, the Congress of Race Equality, were alongside him. But by 1966, many people had questioned that. They were saying, well, this is a violent society. We must fight violence with violence. And that's what was coming out in those particular conversations. And then obviously there is the conversation about Vietnam. And Dr. King was one of the brave individuals who, some would say, he sought to conflate Vietnam with civil rights. But for him, it was part of the same continuum, it was part of the same conversation. And he felt, as a preacher, as a man of God, he had to speak prophetically into this particular situation. And many of his fellow civil rights colleagues thought, this is wrong. You shouldn't mix the two. If you're a civil rights man, just stick with that. Okay. So for me, it's a fascinating documentary, and I'll leave it there.
Yes, thank you. Lisa? Yes.
Hi.
Response to the film or anything general?
1, 2, this works. Okay, good. Yep, so response to the film, it was just powerful, and I was really, really moved, actually. There's a lot of things I learned during the documentary, which was great. You see the speeches. I've never seen something quite so extensive on Martin Luther King Jr. And I think for me, just in respect of the work that I do, I run a program called Black Consciousness and Christian Faith, which is kind of like a bridge between churches and people who have left the church, left Christianity, because they can't see how Jesus and the church speaks to their blackness, speaks to their suffering in Britain, speaks to racial injustice, despite the legacy of someone like Martin Luther King. For some reason in 2018, the message and the gospel of Christ does not seem to resonate and satisfy satisfy their needs, but feed into their feelings and give them a sense of purpose. And so for me, again, I was just reflecting on how people have grown up in the church for 20 years, 30 years, and still feel so despondent and still feel that they struggle, that their blackness is for the weak, and then they become colorblind on a Sunday just to fit in, just to be able to sit down. And it's just shocking, actually, to watch 3 hours of such a powerful man contextualize his faith through his blackness, through the experience of his community. But then there are so many people my age who just struggle to do that and struggle to find people that can mobilize them to think and feel that way, even though for us it's the best way and it's the only way. In every community it should be contextualized. And so I think that for me was just the most striking thing, again, to be reminded that his work was so massive and so global, and yet the resonance for so many people just seems to have died out, which is just such a big shame, I think. That's it.
Good, thank you. Neil?
Sure, good evening, and thanks to Deborah and to Simon for hosting what was a very powerful film. I hadn't seen much of that before. It was a privilege to be here. So I'm very touched by the oratory, the passion of using the churches, which was a vital part of the whole movement, of course, was the church tradition there. I learned also, I think, and I say there was some humility, that what Citizens does is part of that legacy. I know that because I've followed the legacy through, which is that the training that Martin Luther King did, as well as Flora Parks and others, was done by the Tennessee Highlands Training School, which still goes on. The curriculum that they followed is exactly the same curriculum that Citizens UK has taught for 30 years now. We borrowed it from the Tennessee Highlanders Training School. The other thing that was linked to the curriculum is all about power, basically, if you need to know it. We're still running it. There's one starts next week. And getting people comfortable with power. And Rosa Parks, of course, didn't just accidentally stand up in the bus. That was an action. It was planned, it was targeted. She looked a vulnerable lady. She was not a vulnerable lady. Well, she was very vulnerable, but she was a very active member of the SLC. She was chosen, as well as the press were there when she did it, of course. It was what we do in Citizens, a public action, to get a reaction, and that was a magnificent reaction. Months of boycotts. We could never pull that off here, I don't think. I mean, we pull actions, but no more than that. It was nearly a year, wasn't it? 11 months. It was December. It's remarkable tactics there. The other thing that is part of the legacy, I think, which we're trying to sustain, is a lot of the people who were involved in the civil rights movement became organisers. A guy called Arnie Graf, I know well, and is just retired. He was part of the civil rights movement, piggybacking a bit on what was going on there. Then he and others, with Ed Chambers and Saul Alinsky, set up the Industrial Areas Foundation, which we have been in relationship with for 30 years. They taught me the power of, which Martin Luther King taught also, of organising institutions. It's a quick way of finding organised people, and that has served us very well. We are an alliance of faith institutions. In the 21st century, we can't just have Christians. Sorry, Christians? You've got to have the Muslims, you've got to have the Sikhs, and you've got to have the secular folk. Because there's less of us who are prepared to be organised than there was. And this pernicious drift towards shopping and individualism is extremely unhelpful for the human condition. Because people in groups are safer. People in groups are able to learn and train and do stuff together, and when they want, turn out together. I've just been on the march today for trying to stay in Europe, and it's a good issue. There's 100,000 people, fantastic, good spirits and so on. But it feels like the issue is not as cutting edge as that issue was there. So Martin Luther King took an issue, he ran with it, but not in a he ran with it a sophisticated way. And those people grew in the process, of course. That's what he said. The best thing that's happened, I haven't seen it before, was the internal transformation, I think he said, of the black community to feel more powerful, to act on their interests, and to win, of course. They won. That's a fantastic legacy for anybody.
Thank you, Neil. Selina?
Thanks. I just found the whole film so inspiring. Part of my work and my interest is really about activism and organising within churches and how we develop a culture of action so that we link our belief in the kingdom of God, our belief in the gospel, with what that means in the practice of our ministry and in our mission in local communities. And I was so just amazed at the level of clarity of thought and the specificness, the specificity of what they were asking for. So it was easy to measure, whether they had achieved it or not. That moment where, Martin Luther King is saying, they've given us 2 of the things we want, but there's still 2 more that we don't yet have. And the determination to see it through. A few things really stuck in my mind. One of them was where he says they expected 50 to 60% of people to get involved with the boycott. They had 99% of the black community saying, we're not going to take the buses, we're going to walk or carpool. And I just thought that just struck me as just a sign of the unity and the consensus, the kind of agreement that we all want this and we're all going to do our part. And it just inspired me to think, actually, how do we, and because of the way my brain was, I thought about lessons we can learn, and how do we cultivate that kind of unity. And I'm probably moving ahead in questions. But it made me just reflect on that, the idea of proximity to the problems, you know, the suffering that we experience, but also being near to the issues, clarity around what exactly it is that we want to do, and that sense of unity.
Thank you. Dionne.
And so I'll say something, well, first of all, my response to the film. So like Richard, we saw this a couple of months back, and I was moved then and, you know, had a whole set of internal reflections, and some of those actually just silenced me for a moment because I didn't have the words to translate the emotion that was going through me. And I felt, you know, so this is the second time seeing it, you know, am I better at that? A little bit, but not hugely. I'm still moved by that. And inspired by that, and I'm pained by that, having to see some of those witness accounts. To connect that then to kind of the film and what we do, I do work for Christian Aid, but I'm also a Tipping Point board member, and so co-lead some of the campaign, the MLK campaign with Deborah. And a few years back, Christian Aid turned 70, and part of the research in kind of, you know, what's the history about, is that we discovered that Christian Aid played a role in, was it the late 60s, early 60s, when Martin Luther King came to the UK, and they acted almost as his press office. And in discovering that, learned a lot more about the people, the Poor People's Campaign. And ultimately that's speaking to, you know, what King talks about, triple evils, race, economy, and war. And he also then worked on the Economic Bill of Rights. As we worked through that, those things are still true today. And I kept reminding myself through the film that when you are on this pursuit for justice and equality, it's not a one-time win. You don't achieve it and then, you know, it's finished for good. You have to keep reclaiming that, and you have to keep recapturing that ground in pursuing justice in those three areas. So if you looked at race, and you looked at economy, and you looked at war, and you looked at how, you know, the public narrative around that, that is as true today as it was in the 60s. And so watching Dr. King and his methodology and the clarity of his thought and how he's able to bring together what essentially is a human rights agenda but through a faith-based lens does not mean these two things are in conflict. And I work in a space where often they are perceived to be in conflict. You're either driven by a set of faith values that somehow do not speak to your human values and a human rights agenda. And you could have a whole conversation about what that looks like. But it's how Dr. King politicizes his theology. And so it's not an either or, it's a both and. And that hugely inspires me as a Christian, but it also inspires me as an activist. So I'm not surprised I'm working in social justice. And so, you know, today, I think it's 9, right? It's 10 past 9. And we're 6 hours ahead of the US. And so today in the US, I think it's in your little program, there is a march on Washington today that's being led by Reverend William Barber and the Poor People's Campaign. And so, you know, it feels like, actually, though there's a few of us here, we are in solidarity with a whole, you know, kind of thousands of people. I'm not sure if it's going to look like the images we saw in the film, but they're still committed to this agenda and saying something is terribly, terribly wrong. And we have to come together. And it's not just black Christians, it's white Christians too, but it's not just Christians. You know, it's people of all faiths and it's people of no faiths, because actually the volume and the mass of us standing together is where our strength is. And so we have to kind of get into the language of we, us and ours, and not me, myself and I.
Thank you.
I could say lots more, but I'll stop there.
There is a question for the panel from someone asking, you know, what can we do, or 3 things that we can do to counter the terrifying rise of the far right in Europe? Whoever that question was from. We'll come back to that, but do we have any more written question, or is there a question from the floor? Because we do have a roving mic. If you want to make a comment on the film or observation or question. Yes, we've got 2 people here. Let's take these 2, one at the front and one at the back. This young man at the front, right there.
Where?
Just there between these 2 women.
Thank you. Thank you for the compliment of saying young man. I am ageless, actually, because I was in Detroit in the 60s, certainly, and working in the black community. and at the time when Martin Luther King came through Detroit and then was later assassinated. One of the things that none of you have actually said is that what Martin Luther King was saying at the outset was, these are our rights by statute. And that's the whole message that he was really putting across. It was that the essential created government of the United States was to allow the kinds of things that he then worked on and brought in as being Christian, etc. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And someone right at the back.
Thank you. I was just reflecting on Dr. King's personal journey from what I sense in the film and his strive for obeying God's calling as he perceived to be God's calling for him, and also his love for God. So with so many competing agendas and distracting agendas that each of us face, how shall we refocus ourselves on God's calling for us?
Okay, we'd like the panel members to hold that question. Maybe two can answer. We had someone at the back, and then we'll just take this last question and we'll get some responses. See you.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing the film here. It was extraordinary. And on top of all the things that have been mentioned so far, one thing that struck me was the power of music in it, and the role of music, and the strength of the arts as well. I come from an organisation called Journey to Justice, and we're a human rights education organisation in the UK. And we have a travelling exhibition which tells stories of people from the US civil rights movement whose names are not so well known, but we include, for example, a man called Elmore Nickelbury, who was one of the sanitation workers in Memphis, and we tell his story and his wife's story, and one of the young people on that Birmingham Children's March, and we link it with British stories of human rights struggle and the arts, the role of the arts, and we teach about how change happens. So I don't want to mention it because this is such an audience who might be interested in Journey to Justice. It's in Dorset at the moment, it's going to Liverpool and coming to Islington next year. And we have an event on July 12th if people want to get involved. And I will tell all the groups about the film if you're wanting to show it throughout the country. It's a wonderful film. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Last question there for the time being. Young man, just there.
Thank you very much. I was just reflecting on King's philosophy of nonviolence and nonviolent protest. And I was thinking also of his legacy and looking at America today. And I was thinking of Colin Kaepernick. I'm sure you all heard of him, the NFL player who's created a lot of controversy because he's protesting in a non-violent way by kneeling during the national anthem. And so my reflection really was, why is non-violence so controversial? It was controversial during King's time, and it's still controversial now, particularly as a black person, Colin Kaepernick, protesting in a non-violent way, and it's still not being accepted. And so, yeah, it's just my reflection. I'd just be interested to know what the panel think about that.
Thank you. Just to say that the film, of course, stopped at 1968, but a year after that, James Cone wrote a very, very powerful book entitled Black Power and Black Theology. 20 years later, Cone wrote another book that actually compared the philosophy of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. We saw some of the clips when King did his tour of the North, how traumatized he was by the poverty that he actually saw. What we seldom don't see is the picture of Martin Luther King with Malcolm X. And there is a view towards the end of King's life, especially after his Riverside speech in 1967. Some would argue that King became radicalized because of his direct attack on the Vietnam War. So I think there are images of King, there are prisms through which people see King, And of course, you were right about the first thing. King did point out that the constitutional contradictions in the first part of his Eye of the Dream speech. And I think that's a very, very important thing, because King was basically saying, as you rightly say, these are our rights. And they've been fighting for those rights for the last 300 years. So I think those are powerful things. Now, 2 questions. The one about focus from the back, if someone could take that, and also, why is non-violence a controversial issue? I wonder who would like to take the first one about King and focus. Selina. King and focus.
So in terms of how you stay focused and discover what you should do and how to, be true to God's calling for justice, I think that we can be imaginative about what that looks like. So I think that when we're trying to discern what God is asking of us, there's some very clear things, if we look at the life and the ministry of Jesus, that kind of indicate to us his interest in the poor and the oppressed. He says it explicitly that he's come to set free the oppressed, and his ministry is constantly reaching the marginalized and those pushed to the side and downtrodden in his time. So we can see from the life of Jesus that actually he's really interested in freeing those who are experiencing any form of oppression. So that can be a really crucial thing for us. And when we think also about what the gospel means and the good news, that isn't simply a personal message, but is leading us to the understanding of all creation being redeemed. So that is about the earth that we live in. It's about our structures and our society, the way we live with one another. So that's, I think, the broad strokes in which we can understand what God might be calling us to in terms of justice. And when we think about the specifics of that, I think can depend a little bit on the things that we've been exposed to, the things that rest on our hearts and anger us, I think. In organising, we talk about anger a lot and what makes you angry. And not seeing anger as the enemy of love, but actually, I think, the other side of love. And when we're angry because our fellow brother and sister's been violated, that's something that is a righteous anger, and that can lead us towards action that can make a difference. So I think being attentive to the voices of people around us and what they're suffering, and being attentive to what God might be saying to us about what we can do about that situation.
Thank you. Before we take the question from someone over there, I'd like if someone would like to respond to the controversial nature of non-violence.
I can do 3 questions in one, in a way.
Good,
That's
even
right.
better.
The question about what do we do about the far right, both in Europe and in Britain, of course. King said that the people who love peace need to organise as well and as better than the people that love war or violence. That was directly pretty well quoted from Martin Luther King. So organising is the alternative, of course. Non-violence is very interesting because I think we got soft about non-violence, really. It is very sophisticated and it's very effective. There's a question which I know my American colleagues have, is why there's never been a civil rights movement in Britain. It's partly because the system absorbs dissent politely, carefully, gently. We'd never have police doing that. We have seen police doing some of that stuff in Britain, but very rare. And if they did, they would definitely be punished for it, and there'd be an inquiry and a commission and all that stuff. But basically, I think we should return to being non-violent. Looking to Simon, because this church is a member of Citizens, we've got soft on the actions. We're running the living wage campaign. There are now 4,500 people paying this voluntary living wage. That was it wasn't King's idea, but it basically is what he was arguing for, was a living wage. We've got there by doing all sorts of nice things, because we capitalise on the British talent of being polite by going to supermarkets to give flowers, get a relationship, give chocolates, and so on. And slowly we've won over some of the corporates who do pay this on a voluntary basis. This gentleman's point about he was trying to get the law implemented, or the constitution there. In Britain, of course, we don't have a constitution. We have the system. And the system is whatever it makes it is. So today's march has all been about how we have to vote. Mrs. May says, no, you don't have a vote. In fact, Parliament doesn't have a vote on this. The system morphs into something else, which is why we have to act. If we don't act, the system will get away with murder almost. So public action using non-violence is the way forward. I organise people with larger numbers of people focused on that is the way forward to get the system to work for us. It won't work for us if we don't persuade it to.
Just a second, Dionne, did you want to come back? Do you want to come in very quickly? Then we've got 3 rounds of questions. We've got 1, 2, Oh, we've got 5 now. Okay, that's good. But can we make the questions very, very short? Let's get a response. Dionne, quickly, please.
So quickly, just to build on some of the stuff that's been said by the two panellists here, is to say, so if that's the way in how we're going to do that, this is the way we're going to respond, then what are the actual areas that we're going to focus on, and how are we going to do that? So part of that is about, kind of organising, but being really clear about how we organise, but on what issues. And so to give you a bit of a flavour of what that conversation could look like from the church's perspective, and I'm talking about kind of when the global church comes together. So I've just come back from Geneva just Thursday. And in that space, this was a kind of World Council of Church audience, but, they also had friends and observers there too. And in that space, the focus word, so this was 7 days, and it was a hard 7 days, but the focus word was justice. And so that, our role then as people of faith is to secure and pursue justice. It's not going to just happen. And you do that in a non-violent way, and people have explained, kind of how you can do that smartly. But on what? And so the 4 kind of key words that were being used is economic justice. King talks about that. Gender justice in terms of violence against women and beyond. Peace and justice, speaking to the war and conflict, if we look at that across the world, where that's got us. And climate justice in terms of the environment and creation being violated. And when you start to dismantle what the issue is, you can't just call it out and say, because King was great at kind of speaking truth to power and calling that out, but you also have to kind of come with a solution. So what does justice look like? And we have to, Scripture can help us discern some of that, but you have to speak to beyond yourself. So this can't just be the church talking to itself. It's the church talking to the world, but also acting together in order to bring the right solution. So you can't just call it out, you've got to have a vision for what the answer is.
Thank you, Dionne. I'm mindful that we've got a number of people who want to get a question. Yes, please.
I had a privilege of attending Martin Luther King's church in Atlanta, and I was shocked how small it was. I attended the extension, and I could see how the church has a great influence on the community. I'll just be short, because the thing is that there was a teacher's strike at the time, and the sermon was about how do we sort this out. I don't think the church does that here. And I just picked up the phone when the gentleman said the system absorbs. I don't see how the system has absorbed the economic injustice of black people, which has been going on forever. And when you see the number of deaths in prison, the number of black exclusions in schools, how is the system absorbing that? I'd like to know.
Okay, good. Can we have a few, we have a couple of Rosemary.
Can you turn the microphone on? It needs to be off.
Then we have a couple over there, and over there we've got one. Let's get some more voices. Yes, please. It doesn't have to be a long question, it could just be a comment. So, yes.
Okay, so mine was, I think, following on from Dionne's in terms of asking, well, what is the action? And focusing on that. But also, sorry, I forgot your name. Connecting that with not just action, but informed action, intelligently informed and educated action. So you said that we do not have a constitution, and in a sense you're wrong. We do not have a constitution embodied in a single document. What we do have is case law, and it means that you have to take time to ask the question and seek it. And in that sense, you find things that other people are not looking at, and that way inform and surprise by being informed by what's already encased in our own case law.
Good, thank you. Someone over there, woman over there with the black top, yes.
Hello, thank you so much for this amazing film. It was very insightful and really opened my eyes. Today we were at the huge, massive anti-Brexit protests with 100,000 people. But something, I think, as gentleman on the stage rightly pointed out, was missing from that. In comparison to the sophisticated manner in which we see the civil rights movement and how it took off and how they inspired 99% of people to take part in the boycott. What's missing from the modern protest movement? And why, after 50 years, do we still see institutional racism? Why do we still see so much injustice? Why hasn't the momentum of Martin Luther King carried on over the last 5 decades? And what needs to change? How do we change it?
Right. Okay, did we have just, yes, one more there, then we get some response from the panel, please.
Thank you again for the opportunity to see this film today. One of the things that, one of the comments from Martin Luther King that really struck me was his comment about the need for sacrificial love. What does it mean in our lives to sacrifice for one another? And especially as you become more and more aware of where there is injustice, this growing injustice. The world is no better today than 50 years ago. I work in the Middle East, I work in Palestine, and there the churches are calling out for sacrificial love from their brothers and sisters in Christ around the world. They feel misunderstood, forgotten, neglected in the place where Christianity was born. You know, why aren't the churches speaking out? Why aren't the churches taking the real heart of the gospel and the social justice? I'm looking for the prophets of today. Where are the prophets? Where are these voices? I didn't know very much about what you've just, all the organizations you represent, so that's very interesting. But
Thank you very much. Listen, that's a very important question. Where are the prophets? And what are we going to do about sacrificial love to bring about transformation? Can we get some quick responses from the panel, please?
I think the prophets are what the lady was talking about at the back. They're all amongst us, yes. Frankly. They're people that speak out. They're courageous people, individuals on their own. And it's a wonderful work you're doing to try and highlight the fact that everybody potentially is a leader, effectively, and that's important. The press tend to focus on celebrities way too much, but frankly, we need them sometimes. But mainly, we need lots and lots of people to feel that they have got some issue they want to take on. It's best done together. It's safest done together. I think we're missing today just a knee-jerk reaction was music. We got whistles and ridiculous things, and we all booed when we went past Downing Street. That's naff, basically. We could have been much more sophisticated. The music in there, the gospel music that was there is transformative. It touches the soul. And we're not prepared to touch the soul in case it's embarrassing or something like that. But there's lots that we can learn today from the practices they had there.
Yes.
I was also just going to add to that. So most of the people that I work with when I run the programs are people that have come, black people, that have come from black majority churches. And obviously that's kind of been the focus of the documentary. And I think in terms of the prophets, a lot of the people that I work with are people that have left the church because they tried to say something and were kicked down. So they are prophets, but despondent, broken, and redundant. They've been made redundant completely. So they're actually just marginalized on the wayside and are not cultivated or grown to be the prophets, to move the church forward, to critique society's ills. And so for me, I feel like I meet these prophets every week, and every time I run these sessions, I'm just like, oh, you're just nowhere. They end up in no man's land. Because they get so broken in their churches. I'll finish there.
Just to say, and going on to, just adding on to what was just said now, I mean, in terms of Dr. King and the whole civil rights movement, particularly the church, he was very much atypical. You sometimes get the sense that, at that particular point, the church was very radical. It wasn't. It was very conservative with a big C and a small c. And the fact is, King ended up leaving the NBC, the Baptist denomination, and setting up his own denomination because they thought he was political. They didn't like the idea of him mixing politics with religion. And then moving on to the other issue, one of leadership. Yes, he was charismatic. He was a fantastic leader. There was something about him that inspired. He clearly wasn't the first leader. One of the, and when you look at the first, the bus boycott, they had boycotts before that, but he was the only one who could actually sustain something. He managed to inculcate a sense of solidarity. He managed to get them to sort of work together. And there was just something unique about him. But the problem is, he dies, and everything just ossifies. It just falls apart. And that's always the danger in having that type of leadership, where one person is at the head, and once the head goes, it just dissipates.
So I was just going to say the letter from the Birmingham jail it's wonderful, I think, because there are so many liberal, that would happen now, liberal ministers who would write to a minister that was standing out to say, back off a bit, it'll sort itself out and stuff. That would happen here as much as anywhere else. I'm sure you're right. He was not on his own, but he was unique.
Selina?
I was just going to say something quick about, I think, that our churches along with society are kind of fall into the same trap of being very comfortable and desiring to feel safe. And so I think in church we've lost sight of Jesus, who was so radical he was crucified, because the kingdom he was declaring was completely contradictory of the status quo. And I think that we have a view of Jesus that's very softly Jesus, kind of strumming a guitar and sitting in a field with daisies. And we've kind of lost sight of the reality of who Christ was, and it's in the scriptures for us to see. He's hated by religious leaders, hated by political institutions. And so I think if we capture a little and remember Jesus a little bit more in his true nature, I think that would shape who we're actually worshipping when we come to church. It would shape the way that we preach, the things that we talk about, the things that we think we should be doing as Christ followers. So I think all of that shapes why some of the legacy of King has been watered down or hasn't been followed, because we've lost sight, I think, of Jesus as he is, as well as the people who've gone before us who really took him seriously.
Thank you.
And so to follow on from that, the comment here, kind of what is the focus, or what's missing. I think part of what's missing is a structural analysis, one that is shared by all of us. So what Dr. King was really good at is giving a comprehensive analysis of what the problem was, and recognise that this is, although it was affecting individuals, there's a system and a structure at work. And the task is to dismantle that structure. So you've got to expose it to say, this doesn't just happen. Grenfell didn't just happen. Incarcerated and the numbers of disproportionate young black men doesn't just happen. There is a system at work, and you have to name and call out the system. And that puts you, as an individual, your head above the parapet. I would say to the question, where are the prophets? Don't look for them in the usual places. They never start off with a public platform. They are driven by something in here that's about their passion. And words which King says, it's wrong, it's evil, and it's unjust. And you've got to get angry about that. And only when you get angry do you find maybe a journalist finds you. Maybe somebody wants to hear your, capture your quote. And then somebody comes looking for you to say, are you so-and-so? Who said, but the anger inside you drives you. And you say, not on my watch. So don't look for them in those public platforms, because those who already got the microphones ain't going to jeopardize that. And when I talk about the system and structures, the institutional church has been here for a long time. The church has its own system and structures. And, if you're going to break that from within, you have to call out the church to remember its true mission.
Do we have a couple more questions? Someone who hasn't spoken. Yes. One at the back, one at the front.
Thank you so much. And it was a powerful film, and one was very hard to watch. And also, I enjoyed very much. I'm a student of theology from Robert Beckford, and I wanted to say this because it's something that I've noticed, and I think that's why I'm here. Really, you ask me where the prophets are. I am an ordained prophet or an anointed prophet. I find that when you take words to church to tell them how they can improve or what you find is going wrong, one being a woman is a problem that they don't want to listen to you because you're a woman and what do you know? And then the other is we have this Holy Ghost effect that makes you fall asleep in the church. So we're serving Jesus and we're asleep. We're not understanding the mission of Jesus Christ, which is to go out there and fight for people. And I find that Martin Luther, this movie, although I read him on a piece of paper when I was studying, but he came to life to me today. And what I saw was a man tirelessly going out there, risking his life to fight for injustice. He said a threat of injustice here or something like that. It's justice everywhere, you know, injustice everywhere. And a lot of stuff are happening to people in our communities. And the church claps their hands on Sunday. And then they go to sleep on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and we come back again. And in that time, things are happening to people. So none of my questions, it's not a question, it's a contribution I'm making here. That our churches need to wake up and stop sleeping so that we can let people outside who have left their Jesus can actually come back and say, you know what, I find that you are the reason why I want to know Jesus. But you're the reason why I'm leaving Jesus. Do you know? And for me, I think the church needs to wake up and do what my professor says, do praxis, join in the fight.
Thank you very much. One of the great sermons of Martin Luther King is entitled Remain in the Wake Through a Great Revolution. And there's this symbolism of Rip Van Winkle going up to the mountain, and on his way there he passes a picture on a tavern of King George I. On the way down there is a picture of George Washington. And so poor old Rip has been asleep for 20 years and a great revolution is actually taking place. King reminds us that we've got to be attentive to what's taking place in our own era, in our own time. Otherwise we might be in danger of being asleep when these amazing things are taking place. So thank you for that idea, sister. We are going to keep awake. Someone who hasn't spoken, someone at the back, wasn't it? Yes. And then we've got Julian at the front.
The thing that I noticed on the last two European marches and from King's stuff is we're very good at criticising the current dystopian nature of society. We're not very good at defining the utopian nature of the society to which we are trying to reach. The kingdom of God is at hand. We're not very good at describing what it looks like.
Thank you. We've got Julian first, then chap at the back. Unless it's quicker to pass the microphone back. Okay, Julian's after. Okay, yes.
Okay, I'll be as brief as I can. It's in present company. I mean, you guys are a really good crowd, and more anointing to your elbow in that respect. It was an incredible film. There's much in terms of contextualization that, I mean, it just bypassed me. What the media, you know, I mean, okay, fine, let me just go on to the thing because you know what I'm going to say about all that and what we didn't know before. Really, sir, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Neil
Jameson.
Sorry?
Neil,
okay, so it's James, Neil, okay, Neil, right, okay. You really touched on a very fine point, really, about the system. And I've been watching the system, I guess I'm a grand young age of 51, and I've been following politics since I was 12, a Thatcherite baby, watching her actually realise that she was in power, first woman prime minister. So I look back on then and all the years and years and years following in terms of the system, and I can absolutely emphatically probably affirm very accurately that what you said about this, in my words now, this evil, pernicious snake that has a way of slithering in the grass. You think you see it because it's green upon green, and then it disappears. Now, this is the scenario. Martin Luther King, Moses, fine, Elijah, they're crowd pullers. All these, we get our crowd puller in our generation, our prophet.
That's beautiful thought. Thank you very much, sir. Julian, your question.
I just want to ask the question.
That's it. Thank you for the contribution. Thank you for the contribution. We get that. Stake in the grass, green, beautiful. Yes, Julian.
I think, just very quickly, if we can not give sermons and just give quick questions, that will be really helpful. Thank you very much.
How does the church address the current economic arrangements when the historic churches reinforced existing system by depending upon their inherited wealth and investments, and the Pentecostal churches reinforce it with the prosperity gospel, which just assumes that you do well within the existing system too.
Right. We're going to take one more question, and I'd like to get some response to two things. The issue about sacrificial living, and then Julian's question about how the church deals with these two polar issues. So if we can go to, there was someone at the back, wasn't there? Someone who hadn't spoken before. Yes, right at the back.
One other.
Did you want, yeah. I'll tell you what, we've heard your contribution. Thank you very much. We want to give other people an opportunity to speak. Thanks. Yes, at the back. Yes, at the back.
Hello. Just a few brief comments. First of all, what is the purpose of this evening? Are we celebrating the life of Martin Luther King as shown in the film? Or are we trying to solve today's world's problems in this Q&A session? I was privileged very recently to attend a concert by Joan Baez, who's been part of the civil rights movement and been singing about it for the last 60 years. In terms of the film, I was shocked at the violent treatment of the black people. I was also astounded that there was so much footage and close-up and from height of crowds and so forth, and just wondered where that came from. One important difference between now and then, I think, that nobody has addressed is the authorities didn't know how to respond to such a strong anti-violent movement because they were afraid of the power of communism. And also the US was beginning to lose the war in Vietnam. And these were very important factors in the way the white powers reacted to the black non-violent movement, I believe.
Right, thank you very much for that. Can we get some response from the panel, please? Firstly, about the sacrificial issue that was raised, and also Julian's question about how we deal with some of the economic problems when the church is almost buying into the system.
Well, try that one, if you like. The crisis for faith is we're losing numbers. We are not relevant anymore. If a church is not relevant, why do people go there? Potentially because they're getting old and they think they're going to die and they have to make sure that they're going to go to heaven, or whatever it is. But basically our churches are not full of young people, and Pentecostals do quite well, and of course mosques do very well. But basically the adversary for faith is consumerism. It is all the other things that are so much more attractive than we are. So I think, and I would love the church, or faith, including the Muslims, to be an advocate for justice. But because the biggest crisis for faith is we're losing numbers. I'm a Quaker. When I started to organize, there were 23,000 accredited Quakers paying money. There are now 13,000 of them. The Methodist Church is likely to go out of business in 10 years' time. That and the Baptist Church, I don't think is doing much better, frankly. That is terribly serious for democracy. Because where we learn to work together is in these sorts of institutions, and trade unions, of course. If our institutions flounder because they haven't got the right message, or they're trying to sell insurance and so on, like the unions are, then where will people learn how to work together? And I hate this evening to break up fractured because you haven't had a chance to ask your questions, because we're trying to focus very much on the solutions, I hope. But I think the solution for faith is to be relevant to people's lives, to be relevant absolutely to young people's lives, and then have tools you can use to solve the problems they've got, which may well be low wages. And I'm sorry to mention living wage. Living wage is a voluntary wage you don't have to pay, and frankly, we would like lots of people to pay it. I'm glad that 4,500 people do. Much more importantly is for our faith institutions to stay relevant, be relevant to their people's lives so that more people go, including the trade unions, and absolutely including the Muslims, who have the much bigger problem than Christians because they don't feel welcome here. 3.5 million people don't feel welcome. That's very dangerous for a democracy.
Dionne.
So to pick up on the question around the kind of the economy, so what's the solution in that? So I think, depending on it doesn't depend on what sector you work on. The current economic model is broken and it's not working. Well, I think it's not working for the bulk of people. And so I think, what's the church's role in doing that? I think the church needs to think about how it works with its own advisors, those who are speaking and can advise those in leadership in the church, about the current system and what the alternative model looks like. And there's several out there, so it could be from around your position on tax, it could be just how you support the most vulnerable in society, so you have to rebalance the pot. And you need to speak to people who, economists, who are working with an ethical mindset or are Christian or are driven by those values. And I'm not sure that the church has those advisors in place. The Church of England does, because it's got a whole investment wing and trying to do that ethically. But per se, I'm not sure that that's out there in the public square. We don't do it. I come from the kind of Pentecostal wing of the church. I'm not aware that they have that conversation, and if they do, it's quite reactionary as opposed to thinking long term and how you speak then to those in authority to remodel or to re-establish what should be. So to some degree, we're behind the curve. The church is behind the curve because it's focused on other things. So to pick up your point, at times it feels the church is more concerned with what happens on a Sunday morning than what's happening between Monday to Saturday.
One of the things that we were trying to do this evening is to think about how, what are some of the challenges for churches as we try to contextualize King's thoughts and King's organising strategies. I think over the last 20 years, especially doing some work with Neil and our citizens, if I've learnt one thing about how you bring about change, you can only do change by one word. Organise, organise, organise. Because unless you organise and strategize, the power structures have a way of reconstituting itself. Call it co-option, call it what you will. But organising is really, really serious. And because justice is not just a faith issue, churches have got to get better at doing organising with other people. I remember when we organised in the East End of London with the Muslims to get them some more space for their centre, and how the powers that be were almost terrified. Here for the first time you had people of faith and no faith working together for a common agenda. And we won that campaign. We won that. We did that by actually organising. The woman at the back was asking about what are we trying to do this evening? Well, of course, one of the things that we are trying to do is to think about King's legacy and how we make that relevant for our age. But also the film was a powerful reminder, especially if you saw many of those clips for the first time, of how short our memories can be historically. What we saw there were cadences of desolation, how black people were struggling. You saw the campaign in Memphis with the men walking with the placard, I am a man. We're talking about a country that talks about liberty and freedom and yet still treats its citizens in that way. So of course we can't solve all of those problems, but what we can do is to think about now, because history has a funny way of reminding us that we've all got blind spots. So the question for all of us are, what are some of the contemporary blind spots around justice, around immigration, around incarceration, that we need to actually think about? Because, as Neil rightly said, the church is appearing to decline in terms of numbers, but the church is still a powerful moral force. Unless that can be harnessed, I think some of these justice issues, one great theologian, Harvey Cox, says, unless Christians take up the struggles, he said that we're leaving it up to the snake. And, however you define that snake, I think there's something true about, good people filling in the gap. If there is someone here this evening who's got a burning question, you haven't had the opportunity to speak, I think this might be a good time for Wale to give you the mic. It could just be an observation, something you want to actually say, because we're almost coming to an end of the evening. Is there such a person? You've had to go.
Somebody who hasn't answered the question, ideally.
Okay. Yeah, man.
Good man.
Good.
Yes, my name is Solomon, and I've been very much interested in Martin Luther King for a very long time. But in my view, this powerful message that he actually left with us is that triple evil message thing. But as a people, as a society that follow Martin Luther King, we have not actually addressed those three issues. It is very contemporary today. Because you see, racism, poverty, economic injustice. And then these three things are not addressed. And then it's just front and center in our society today, everywhere. So I don't know if the panel want to touch on that extensively.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Panel, would you like to respond to anything you've heard?
Quote from Martin Luther King. He said that justice delayed is justice denied. Don't leave this building with no plan. Everybody should have a plan for themselves and their family. If you're in an institution, organize it, reorganize it, get it to relate to its neighboring institution. 2 institutions are better than 1, given that we're losing numbers and so on. So justice delayed, and there is injustice everywhere. There's justice denied.
Martin Luther King made a very, very powerful statement when he talked about where we stand in moments of convenience or moments of challenge. And I think, in all of our communities, in all of the spaces that we operate, we have an opportunity to be a voice for the voiceless. We have an opportunity to be the prophets, the prophetesses, the people who actually speak truth to power. But don't forget, sometimes, in order for you to actually do that, you may have to sacrifice some of your own comforts. And for some people, it means sacrificing their lives, like the people that you talked about. All we're saying is that Martin Luther King's legacy lives on because fundamentally Martin Luther King believed that there are certain things in society which are politically unsound. And we can find those things. But we also know that there are certain things which are sociologically untenable. They just don't work. We don't, whether you talk about the mass incarceration of black men or Black Lives Matter, whatever the issues are. But I think as people of faith, and sometimes even people of no faith, there are certain things which are actually morally wrong. And we as individuals have got to stand up for those things. Martin Luther King, at the end of his life, talked about how he would like to be remembered. And you heard the speech. But one of the things he made it absolutely clear is that he wanted to be remembered as a drum major for righteousness, a drum major for justice, and a drum major for peace. I think we can take any one of those and, as Neil rightly said, decide in our own space, what is it that we're going to actually do to be a kind of a drum major for the issues that we feel passionate about. So we'd like to thank Debbie and the team for bringing the film. It was an amazing film. I'm sure there are people here who would like it to go various places, and do be in touch. But we thank you for that, and of course thank the pastor of this church for making this wonderful place available to us. At this time, if we can give our panel a round of applause, that would be marvelous.
Okay, so I just wanted to say thank you particularly to Wale, who's been the man with the microphone. For those of you who don't know Wale, he's Racial Justice Coordinator for the Baptist Union of Great Britain, and he does a lot more than running around with microphones. He's been instrumental in getting this evening together, so thank you so much for all of your efforts, Wale. It's really greatly appreciated. Thank you to the church here for hosting it. A number of people from the church congregation have been part of this evening. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the audience. A reminder that you should check your programs for details if you want the film to be shown in your area. There's information there about how you can do that. Now, as we close, can I offer a blessing? I'm going to offer a paraphrase I wrote last year of the Beatitudes from the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are those who refuse the lie that one life is worth more than any other, for theirs is the future of humanity. Blessed are those who have stared long into the abyss, for theirs is honesty beyond grief. Blessed are those who resist retaliation, for the earth will never be won by force. Blessed are those who would rather die for truth than live with compromise, for the truth will outlive all lies. Blessed are those who forgive the unforgivable, for they have seen the darkness of their own souls. Blessed are those who know themselves truly, for they have seen themselves as God sees them. Blessed are those who are provocatively non-violent, for they're following the path of the Son of God. Blessed are those who choose to receive violence but not to give it, for the future is born out of such choices. Blessed are you when you stand up for truth and hell itself tries to destroy you. You're not the first, and you won't be the last. I'm telling you now, nothing makes any sense unless you learn to see it differently, and then choose to live that alternative into being.